Hey everyone, this time we read The Race for the Next Game Machine by David Shippy and Mickie Phipps. So this book is great. It does an excellent job of explaining just how hard it is to create a video game console, and it's just it's just wonderful. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the video games themselves. David does mention them a few times in this, but mostly it's about project management. It's about just how the technology is put together, and it's really interesting when you see everything that's in here. And it's kind of crazy when you read about just how the PS3 and the Xbox 360 got made. I do have to say there's some weird tangents in this book. He goes off on some strange stuff, especially at the beginning, and it kind of made me wonder why certain parts were in the book, but for the most part it's very good and he kind of stays on point. Just that first chapter, I was like, why are you telling me these things? Like, is it going to come back at some point in the book? Is it going to matter in any way? And I don't think a lot of it did, but it sets up who David is. But it was just very weird the way he did it. So we start off in 2001 with David being recruited to come back to work for IBM. He had worked for them prior and then left to go do a startup, and then got recruited to come back. He was going to be one of the team leads for this big project that included Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. This was to design like the major chip for the PS3, but that chip was also going to have applications on a bunch of other products for both Toshiba and IBM, and also some other stuff with Sony as well. So right off the bat, you see they're trying to work together with these two Japanese companies and this one American company to try to create a chip that's just going to, one, be in a game machine, but also do a whole bunch of other stuff. So they've got a lot of things they need to kind of juggle to get this right. So right off the bat, we hear about a lot of the fights between the different engineering teams. Because it's not just David's team, he's got to work with a bunch of other people who all have different parts of this chip that they're working on. And as those fights are going on, he talks about the stress and everything involved. He talks about trying to find the right people to work with him. He's trying to build a team that would, one, work well together and also be able to get the stuff done quickly. And he goes over some of the interview process where he had one person on his team who was very biased towards the Ivy League schools, and David was like, "Well, that's great that they've got a lot of background and they went to this prestigious school, but are they a dick?" And if they were, he often was just sort of like, "Well, no, I don't care where they came from. If they're a jerk, then I don't want them working on the team because it's not going to be great for team cohesion," and that sort of thing. You do see some of this come back into play later on in the project when he realizes some of the people that they hired weren't really the right people for that job, or they weren't right for like a management position. They should have been a little bit lower. I've kind of experienced this a few times in my own work. That stuff can be kind of complicated when you have a manager that is kind of just coasting by on the success of everyone around him. And then when those people leave, you kind of see just how crap they really are. Or you have some people who are excellent managers, but they don't really know how to kind of explain the job to other people because sometimes they've never done the job, or it's been like a decade since they did the job and they just don't remember how it's done anymore. One thing I liked about this is when David brings up a mistake that he made, he admits it and he says, "Yeah, it was my fault. I probably could have done better. These are the things I probably could have done." And he talks about how they move forward to either find a solution or they move forward with the solution that they created. This ties into just the incredible bureaucracy that he has to work in. If you've ever worked in a corporate environment, you realize there's a lot of egos get involved in projects, and there are a lot of teams involved, and every team kind of fights for territory and everything. And That's kind of what happened with this project as well, where you had certain people with ideas on other people's projects, and they decided to voice those to management after bringing them up to the team that was in charge of that project, and those guys saying, yeah, we thought about that, we're not doing it, we're moving on. And they just kind of did an end around and went through management. It's bringing up a lot of memories again about just how annoying that can be. I always hated it when stuff like that happened. There's also a lot of talk of trying to keep things on schedule, and this is where the project management side of things kind of comes in. And I'll explain a little bit more about that just in a second. Before I get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about David as a manager, and just some of the thoughts that I had while I was reading this. He seems like a lot of the or at least a lot of the good managers that I've had in the past, where they realize what their strengths and their weaknesses are, and they try to move to find people to fix their weaknesses, and not just in themselves, but in the teams in general. And he really seemed to be like a motivator to get people to kind of do things that he needed them to get done. It sounds like I would have liked to have worked with David at some point on something. I'm not totally sure he would have liked to work with me, but he just sounds like one of the really good managers out there. And that's, again, that might be a little biased because I'm only hearing his side of the story. I'm not hearing from other people. And we're not really hearing as much from his co-author, Mickie, but she probably wasn't in a lot of the higher level meetings that David was in, so that might be why she's not, like, her voice isn't really in this. She did most of the writing, I think, but that was one thing I wanted to point out, because it felt a little weird that we're only really getting David's side of the story, and we're not getting Mickey's side, and we don't always get some of the other people's sides of the story. Regardless of that, though, it does sound like David was always looking out for his team, or at least as best he could. It feels like he was sort of that filter between, like, management and his team. So he would take a lot of just the bullshit from management, and he'd kind of condense it down and go to his team with, okay, these are the things we need to do in order to get done. So basically he was operating as like top cover for his team, so they didn't have to deal with a lot of the management stuff, or at least for the most part they didn't have to, so they could just kind of focus on what they needed to get done. So let's jump over to my whiteboard really quick, and I'll kind of go over like the project management stuff and the scheduling and everything I mentioned earlier. So I wanted to talk a bit about just the scheduling for project management. Usually it starts out with, step A, which is your planning phase, and then it breaks off into the different projects that you have. In this case, B, C, and D. You'll see D is a lot longer. That one's going to take much more time. So you can finish B and C and then move on to their next projects while D is going on. You're also going to see how some of these projects are dependent on others in order to kind of keep the whole schedule moving. So E is going to be dependent on B getting done, and F is going to be dependent on C being done first. You can also see how I made B and E a little bit smaller. Those are going to be the ones that don't take as much time, so you can kind of move those in the schedule if you hit delays. But you need to finish B, E, C, and F before you can move on to the next one, which is G. And then you can also have to have D finish before you can move on to another one. And then those two are both going to be moving on to another project as well, and that kind of leads to the wrap-up phase. What happened with this one is you had a whole nother client added on. So you had Sony, Toshiba, and IBM working, and then about halfway through they added on Microsoft. So think about this chart and then a whole nother set of different projects, like a whole nother chart being added on as well. and you needed to complete all of those in order to move on to the final phase for both projects and then come to the end for the whole thing. This diagram's really a simplified version of the whole process, but you can kind of see how some projects wouldn't take as much time, so you might be able to move resources onto other ones in order to finish on time. It's a huge mess, and it takes forever to really deal with all of this. So on top of all the issues of project management that they were having, not because of what they were doing, but because of all the extra work that was being piled on, we hear about the solutions that they kind of came up with to work around and stuff like that. That was also very interesting to hear about, just because, you have a project like this that was so big, and then they add on the Microsoft project as well. So now he has two parallel sets of customers that have opposing ideas of what they need, or opposing needs, because they're going to be competing against each other. And they don't know that, or they maybe know, but they aren't totally sure that they're going to be having essentially the same chip with like a few different touches in it. So he has to balance the needs of Microsoft and Sony as well as Toshiba against each other, and also keep those separate. And he talks about just how hard that actually was. In explaining that, though, I get the feeling he didn't want to be too specific, obviously. Mostly because I think at the time of writing this, he might have still been under some NDAs and whatnot. He just wanted to talk about kind of the broad strokes of both projects without getting too into the weeds or into like some of the more trade secrets that IBM had used. It also could have been just an attempt to make the book more readable for people like me who don't really have an engineering background or anything like that. It can be kind of annoying when you read some of the books that are written by engineers, or at least have a lot of engineering jargon in them. And you read those and you're kind of like, this sounds really, really advanced and crazy, but I have no frame of reference for what you're talking about. So I'm just going to have to assume that you guys are right and that this stuff sounds impressive. David also brings up how he didn't play video games after college, and he didn't really know exactly what was going on in the video game industry when he joined onto this project. And so he mentions he went out and he bought a PS2 and he started playing. He started playing it to figure out what, the games look like now, what the developers were going to need in order to make their games, and that sort of thing. It's pretty interesting to see him go in that direction and not just, take Sony's word for it on what they were looking for. He kind of wanted to get some hands-on experience to understand what the problems of the developers were going to be and what they were going to be looking like on the PS3. Granted, the graphics were going to be better, but still, it was just kind of cool to read that sort of thing. And he brings up a little bit now about how after the project was over and Microsoft gave everybody that worked on the project their own Xbox 360, he talks about playing games with his kids and everything like that. And that was kind of a cool little story where this project kind of brought him into video games and kind of helped him connect a little bit more with his kids on something that they probably liked. So I really enjoyed reading this book. It taught me a lot about just how hard it was to make these different consoles and everything. And it also kind of reminded me a lot of the project management stuff, like those courses that I had taken over the years, which didn't necessarily bring up good memories, but it brought up a lot of that stuff and kind of made me think about it again and that kind of thing. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. Please let me know what you think in the comment section below, and have a great day, everyone.